Thank you very much as well. And now we are looking forward for the comment by Professor Dr. Romy Klimke. She holds a chair for public law at the BSP Business Law School in Berlin and completed a deputy professorship at the chair for public international law, EU law, and international relations at the Technical University in Dresden. And her research mostly focuses on human rights protection, international public law, EU law, and sustainability law. So the floor is yours.
Yes, thank you very much, Anna, and thank you, Robert, for first of all inviting me to this excellent conference and for giving me the opportunity to present some comments on these really highly thought-provoking papers that I was allowed to engage with, which are really excellently written and cover very topical issues, but are also very different in terms of research topics. So I've decided to use my comment to provide a very general overview on our topic at hand, which is trade aspects of the digital era, and trying to link the specific questions raised to this bigger picture in order to establish a common ground for our further discussion. So I would first like to start by taking a step back in order to gain a broader perspective. So basically, we can travel back to the 1990s. Since then, the face of global trade has changed dramatically, as we all know. There are, of course, several reasons for this: the end of the Cold War, the birth of the World Trade Organization in 1995, as well as the emergence of global value chains. But the most significant new dimension of international trade in the 21st century is how much of it is digital. The digitalization of trade is by no means confined to the sector of information and communication technology. Far beyond the ICT sector, digital trade has become a defining feature in manufacturing, agriculture, mining, finance, and much more. Now, the presentation of our three panelists provide excellent examples of this magnitude of the digital transformation, which generally affects every sector and every stage of global trade. The digitalization of trade not only changes what we trade, but also how and where trade takes place and who trades. Now, to participate in digital trade, it does not need a big firm based in New York, Berlin, or London anymore. Rather, every small or micro business owner, freelancer, or hobby inventor can take part in digital trade. It does not need more than a smartphone to benefit from the digital economy. In a recent count, over 360 million people around the globe participate in e-commerce. So just as a figure, side note. Now, digital innovations have transformed the world so rapidly, as we know over the past few decades, that decision makers at all levels are struggling to keep up. Despite all of these profound trade-altering developments, there are no specific multilateral rules for digital trade. There's not even one recognized and generally accepted definition worldwide on digital trade. So this is the reason why, meanwhile, intergovernmental or governmental digital regulation is taking place with varying objectives and at different paces, primarily at the national and regional level. And the starting question for any legislator is how much to regulate and to what end. And in my opinion, the importance of finding the answers to these questions cannot be overstated. Without a doubt, the digitalization of trade comes with a lot of opportunities, but there are also enormous challenges and risks. Law and policy makers, therefore, are confronted with a broad range of issues that extend from questions of digital inclusion and connectivity to the regulation of new technologies such as artificial intelligence, to the protection of human rights in the digital sphere, and much more. For instance, and now I come to the first presentation by Lino Munaretto, who has highlighted the tensions of the digitalization of the euro with the right to freely conduct business pursuant to Article 16 of the European Union's Charter of Fundamental Rights. Here, first point, while I found your analysis generally clear and well structured, I was wondering whether you could provide some further explanation how this conflict between the digital euro and private businesses would manifest in practice. simply to make your argument more accessible for readers and discussants who are not as familiar with issues of monetary and financial law, just as myself. At the same time, Lino has very rightly pointed out how the EU's current move towards introducing the digital euro illustrates how the European Union tries to defend its sovereignty in the digital sphere, which in the area of digital capital flows and payment is increasingly dominated by private US American payment service providers, which find themselves in a quasi-state-like position to grant or restrict access and participation. And of course, this raises major questions of power relations and power struggles. Then there's the challenge of providing for and maintaining the necessary technical infrastructure. The digital transformation fundamentally depends upon access to and the availability of critical raw materials. Smartphones, laptops, and countless other devices have to be manufactured and transported, undersea cables have to be laid, and data centers built. And in this regard, Raffaele Palermo has highlighted the crucial role of raw materials and how, I quote, "The transition to a green and digital economic system has exacerbated the race to supply and, in particular, to extraction and processing of these materials." The primary instrument to address these challenges in the European Union is, of course, the Critical Raw Materials Act, with a main focus on the internal market, which is why it is based on Article 114 of the Treaty of the functioning of the European Union. But this instrument is complemented by a growing network of partnerships with third countries that the European Union has forged as part of its so-called raw materials diplomacy. So I have one recommendation to Raffaele. You have highlighted several points that, in your opinion, constitute shortcomings of the Critical Raw Materials Act, which are certainly very valid. And I would be interested in whether you could also present some solutions or improvements in terms of constructive critical scholarship. So you indicated, for instance, that it could be necessary to implement a progressive system after the 2030s or from 2030 on. So perhaps you have some specific proposals that you could also add to your paper. But it's not only critical raw materials that the European Union depends upon, but also certain manufactured technological components, especially semiconductors. So to secure a steady and undisrupted supply of semiconductors, it is of the utmost importance, but becomes more and more difficult in an era of what Esther Osalenlen-Adu has termed the so-called techno-economic competition. As I've one comment on your paper, which I generally really enjoyed and liked, and I also agree with you that we as legal scholars should critically analyze unilateral acts, such as the CHIP Act, as any unilateralism always carries risks in international relations. However, I was wondering to what extent the framing of the CHIP Act as supply chain regulation is really useful, and what can be gained from this perspective, from this kind of categorization, because from my view, there's supply chain regulation in the strict sense, like the corporate sustainability due diligence directive or the European deforestation regulation, which is conceptualized around some kind of system of due diligence obligations. And there might be other regulatory tools that you, of course, may also label as supply chain regulation, but then I would like to know what the actual difference is. And last but not least, I have a question to all three of you that basically pertains to the role of the European Union as a global standard setter. So if we look at the global regulatory framework in the area of digital markets and digital trade, the European Union as a regulator finds itself in a situation of global competition, especially with the United States and China. And in this situation of regulatory competition, the European Union has traditionally, at least this is how I conceive it, pursued a regulatory approach that is based on values and fundamental rights, of course, while at the same time trying to preserve its sovereignty. And this approach not only offers an alternative to state-centered approaches of authoritarian regimes, but also conflicts with the position of the United States, which generally intervene very little in terms of regulation. So against this background, my last question would be, to what extent do you regard the instruments that you have analyzed first as a coherent continuation of the EU's digital policies, and second, as a potential blueprint for other state legislators? And of course, we can also pose this question vice versa, and by asking to what extent can these legal instruments aggravate existing geopolitical tensions and conflicts? So, in order to keep my comment brief, I will come to an end here, and I look forward to our discussion. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you, Romy, very much for your comment. So, is there any first question or other comment from the audience, or would someone of you like to reply? Okay, Robert.
Well, thanks to all three of you. Really like the insights from this internal market, external perspective. And this is where my question is going to actually all three of you. First of all, since we have three different instruments that kind of tie this internal, external sphere together, if you perceive there being like an overarching approach or strategy behind that, or is just coping with individual problems one at a time? And the other question that regards this internal-external connection is on how this may have a drawback, a positive drawback on security policy, on the sort of supranationalization of security policy in the long run. I mean, this is kind of looking into the glass globe, but maybe you have an idea on how this internal market policy with this external component may affect security policy in the long run.
Thank you. Either of you?
Should we start?
Yeah, of course, if you would like to.
Okay. Or if you want to, up to you. Okay. Okay. First of all, thank you very much for the comments. So I appreciate it, and also for the question, Robert. So first I would start with the comments. Yes, so I underlined, I emphasized more critical aspects of the critical raw material sector, so more shortcomings. I focus more on those aspects, since I wanted also to understand how, for example, the special report of the European Court of Auditors, and then an action of the European Commission through the Resource EU Action Plan influenced or can influence the implementation of the critical raw materials act, even and above all if we consider that some inconsistencies remain unsolved since they are mentioned in the impact assessment of the critical raw materials act, and then they remain unsolved since maybe the critical raw material act lacks of some it's a little bit, in my opinion, in some enacting terms, it's a little bit shallow, so a little bit sloppy and not that targeted. And that's why I think that we need for the future this maybe a progressive system, as I proposed, for example, on the model of the effort sharing directive in the climate legislation. So we can specify clear objectives for groups, for example, of strategic raw materials or critical raw materials. So so based on reliable data, not just aggregate data, all strategic raw materials 25%, since we have aluminium and copper, and there is a very good level of recycling. But then if you consider gallium or tungsten, there is recycling just 1%. So we don't want to balance and just have 25%, but then there are some strategic raw materials that need more recycling, higher recycling quota. So I think that a progressive system could help, and could help also for predictability of investors. Okay, we have this objective for these raw materials regarding extraction, for example, and this must be, compatible also with the current capacity of the European Union to boost on extraction or on processing or on recycling. And secondly, I think we need, on the field of recycling and resource efficiency, we need more input from above all, the Waste Framework Directive. So we have, for example, an end of waste concept. So it's a little bit technical, but the end of waste concept, there is just a definition, but then the end of waste is very different for the member states. So each member state has a different end of waste concept, which produce also that the mostly rich critical raw materials, waste streams rich and critical raw materials and strategic raw materials are shipped abroad. The first attempt it will be, or entry into force some days ago with the waste shipment regulation, and the European Union classified as hazardous some waste streams, and this so it bans the export to not OSCE countries. So it's like a limitation of the export. So we can, these waste streams and this waste rich and critical raw materials remains in the European Union and can be recycled here. So I think we have two progressive objectives, first of all, as the fourth proposal, I think, and then second, we have to focus on what we already have. We don't need further regulation or further legislative acts like Advanced Material Acts or Industrial Acceleration Acts. We have to focus on what we have, and we have, for example, eco-design of sustainable products regulation. We have battery regulation, so we have to coordinate and to make compatible all these objectives and all targets that are also enshrined in this regulation. And then, so I try to answer your question and also the question of Professor Klimke about continuation or blueprints of the regulatory approach of the European Union. I will focus mostly now on critical raw material sector. We have and it was for me interesting also analyzing it. We have some provision in critical raw material sector that considers, for example, when strategic projects, since we have to consider that most part of strategic projects are settled abroad, so in third countries, these strategic projects shall be run only after also rights, for example, of indigenous people were considered. So there is a specific provision emphasizing and addressing this aspect. But then we have again this problem. So by signing strategic partnerships with third countries, these provisions remains ineffective, or is up then to the third countries, to implement and to apply these provisions, so regarding, for example, indigenous people or resettlement of indigenous people. So I think the critical raw material sector is a good legislative act insofar as it removed this base on this problem. So it focuses on the problem and it focuses on this regulatory approach. It's a typical regulatory approach, but it lacks of consistency if we consider then the effectiveness of some of its provisions. So I hope I answered your question. And as regarding the overarching approach and this supranationalization of security policies, I was also, I'm not sure if what is better, so if overarching approach, I think now also considering strategic autonomy, as I mentioned, Article 114, that is legal basis for Net Zero Industry Act, for Industrial Accelerator Act, for other legislative acts that were adopted according, for example, Competitiveness Compass and Clean Industrial Deal. So we are following an overarching approach. But I repeat again, underline again, which is in this field, in my opinion, it lacks of coordination insofar as we have legislative acts for specific problems like critical raw materials or building up clean technologies capacities and so on. But then we, by adopting these acts, it seems to me that we forget a little bit the overarching approach, so this general approach. So we forget a little bit what we did a few months ago, or what with the European Union, said, or what it adopted some years ago. So this strategy is a little bit blurred, and then we have a double problem, since if we have a blurred strategy, we are not able or fully able to focus also on specific problems and on specific challenges like those of critical raw materials. And so we need resource use action plans. So we need another communication. But why we need this communication? It was not enough. So the critical raw materials sector, a regulation is it's very important legislative. It's not a directive, it's a regulation. So we would have better shaped the regulation, or we can also amend the regulation. We don't need, in my opinion, another communication in which the European Union commits itself to adopt other legislative acts. So. And as regards security policies, and then I finish, sorry, I think the importance of this security and also defense policy is underlined, and I think it's a very good point of the critical raw material sector. So we don't have only critical materials, we have also strategic materials that rely on a different calculation method. And this calculation method considers also the difficulty in supply, the increasing growth, and considers the relevance for the economy, and in particular the relevance for defense and aerospace sectors. And for me, it is also, or I interpret it in this way, that the European Union tried to mitigate some challenges, and then to mitigate some problems that could undermine security considerations. So consideration not only of economic security but also of defense. So for example through procurement. So in this way, to specify and individuate some strategic raw materials allow us to boost also on the aspect of security policy in the internal markets, and also in the defense sector, for example, through a double use, so conceiving a double use of strategic raw materials or products. That is also very important, not only materials but also products that are important or relevant for the security policy. Thank you very much.
So just to answer the professor's question, and also cited by Professor. I'm just going to try to attempt to answer the question systematically through two main overarching themes. So first of all, to address the question on the saliency of my framing of unilateral supply chain instruments? Well, it's intrinsically linked to an overarching framework surrounding supply chain unilateralism, which is derived from basically my literature reading into value chain scholarship, which centrally focuses on power dynamics. For example, value chain scholars throughout previous frameworks and current frameworks have always stressed how, in essence, their research kind of reveals how firms leverage their existing capabilities, not just market share, but also technical know-how and other capabilities in how they shape the value chain creation, who can participate in value chains, and who can be rejected. So in essence, it is a discipline that really tangibly uncovers power dynamics in global trade and production. Now, let's apply that then to state interventions in supply chain in these critical GVCs, because there is a normative element that can be easily classed as a regulatory measure. For example, the CSDDs, the other due diligence and corporate sustainable frameworks. Many have said, oh, these are just regulatory instruments to try to tackle overseas corporate activities, which I agree to an extent. But if you are one of the largest markets in the world in a particular sector, or you have one of the largest and deepest supply capital markets, consumer markets, have a very sophisticated institutional framework, these cannot be treated as simply domestic instruments. They will have an outside impact beyond your prescriptive jurisdiction. But again, as they reflect already existing norms, for example, in the area of business and human rights, or even environmental protection, I can foresee definitely a conversation under the TBT that these are permissible. But then on the other side of the coin, you have the fact that these very particular national regulators at these markets are now increasingly utilizing their market position and existing capabilities in order to attain domestic interests, even though they know it will have an outside impact. As I already highlighted in my research into the global semiconductor value chain, these are highly concentrated in a specific number of markets. So whatever a national regulator does at that particular junction will have an immense adverse impact regardless on even downstream industrial consumers and end users. That requires a legitimate further conversation, especially at the WTO, in order to discipline that exercise. Because now traditionally countries, for example the US, will immediately say that these are national security matters that cannot be addressed. For example, that was the justification of the US after it appealed into the void its recent decision of the January report into the Inflation Reduction Act. So I do hope that my classification of supply chain instrument really triggers a further debate within trade law scholarship, where we have to increasingly take into account the contextual factors surrounding how these instruments were designed. But overall, I do see that the current trend of supply chain unilateralism, which is something I'm further developing in my research, to be now part of the status quo. For example, the fact that there are immense, there's an immense public discourse now on deglobalization, for example, how regional organizations will be much more important when it comes to foreign trade policy and so forth. I think that supply chain interventions will become part of the status quo. It may not necessarily be entirely disciplined within WTO, but I do hope that as we discuss reform matters of the institution, that we do provide a degree of discipline. Do we approach, for example, a sector-specific approach? For example, this was the outcome surrounding the 20-year case around Airbus and Boeing. Maybe something similar should happen when it comes to the semiconductor and steel and critical minerals, because these are the backbones of the current concurrent twin transitions in tech and green energy production. But overall, even though within trade law scholarship we haven't truly grappled with this GVC reality, it is already part of the policy lexicon. For example, after the recent ban on Anthropic's latest model, which happened I think this week, the immediate responses, especially in discourse, was like, well, they cannot do without a market. It was not the language of values on data protection that came later, but it was the fact that how can you exclude one of the largest consumer markets in the world? So even already in the policy lexicon, they are already, the language of power, as seen in value chain scholarship, is already part and parcel of policy discussions. So I think that it's time that we trade scholars also grapple with this which is already shaping trade law practice concurrently. So I'll leave my remarks there.
Thank you very much. I'd like to focus on Professor Klimke's comment, which was very useful because it gives me the opportunity to give some further explanations on my thoughts on the tension and the conflict between public power and market power, between the issuance of the digital euro and the interest of market actors fearing to lose some of their economic freedom. I think it's a common aspect that was brought up in many contributions at this conference, and that of course the efforts of states to strengthen and to bolster strategic autonomy, security, they all come at a cost. They all bring up a conflict between in the relationship between state and market. But what I like to specify, that I don't see that as a zero-sum game in a way that only because in the case of the digital euro, the ECB is issuing the digital euro, that does not mean that the ECB is only its power is only growing and the market is losing authority and possibilities to offer its products. I think it's more complicated. So the ECB rightfully argues also that the market may benefit from the issuance of the digital euro, because also for reasons of strategic autonomy for the economy, it's a redundant payment system can be very useful if systems like Visa or MasterCard would be cut off. But what I also like to explain or show and demonstrate in my paper and my presentation is that I think we have to look at the economic constitution and the monetary constitution in specific of EU primary law to see whether there's a kind of boundaries and limits to shifting power from markets to the state. And I think there's some leeway to go in this direction, but also some limits. And I think it's important that we discuss it because at least for the digital euro, I can say there are many voices raised by in scholarship, but also by political parties that see a real chance to transform the whole system. So right-wing parties and left-wing parties, they see digital money as a big chance to overthrow the whole system, and others fear that this could happen. And I think that we as legal scholars and public law scholars have a responsibility to show how balanced solutions can be found. And I think that the legal design, the current legal design as it is intended, as it is proposed by the legislator, is maybe very conservative, but it's also a balanced solution that tries to balance and recognize both the public interest in securing strategic autonomy and safeguarding monetary sovereignty, but also it's recognizing that the market is the place where innovation can take place, where also financial innovation can take place. And we will have to see where this journey ends, but I'm sure that this conflict will come up in many different cases as well.
Thank you. Any other questions or comments? Yes.
Thank you. My question to Rafaela. Thank you so much for your presentation. I think I found it's very insightful. But actually, I find your analysis quite balanced, where you actually acknowledge the importance of CRMA, but at the same time, you explain about the implementation weakness. And through your presentation, I heard about, you emphasize a lot about the circularity and also recycling. But because I wonder whether do you think you placing too much reliance on circularity given the limitation of physical of recycling and also circularity demand of new technology? Do you think you can rely on this circularity and recycling in the face of new technology? And do you think like it's a good strategy rely on those circularity and also recycling? Because substitution is not quite there yet. We haven't we haven't got into creating new technology with new substitution, and lots of the countries actually not ready. Let's say nuclear energy, some countries actually reject the idea. But do you think circularity and recycling of raw materials it's a good idea to creating this autonomy regarding the critical raw materials? Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you very much for your question. Yes, so first of all, I want just to underline, so to highlight that we are not able, so we cannot expect to rely only on recycling. So we have also to extract, we have to process, and we have to import. So recycling is not the solution for this challenge. Just to retain the waste streams or retain products with critical raw materials or strategic raw materials, recycle it, since also the demand grows. So there are different quotas. I think, nevertheless, my opinion is that it's a good idea to rely on recycling as a part of the strategy. So recycling what we are able to recycle, building up a capacity for recycling, for example, scrap and other materials. There is a debate on lithium, since a lot of scientists, so the battery regulation, for example, states that by 2031 batteries shall have 80% of recovered lithium content. But then scientists say the recovered lithium is not as efficient as pure lithium, so lithium from extraction, for example. So I think we don't have to focus only on recycling. The solution, or a possible solution, where also a connection between science and law possible is also to boost on, in view of the new technologies, also on substitution. So substitution, I think, is a good point. Substitution is not addressed by the Critical Raw Materials Act, is not addressed by the Resource EU Action Plan, so it's just an initial phase, but substitution maybe could be part of this new act that the European Commission wants to adopt, so Advanced Materials Act or Industrial Accelerator Act. So try to create or try to rethink that, for example, permanent magnets that are useful for wind turbines could be replaced, and we have actually technically and economically feasible technologies that could replace, in some cases, permanent magnets and with other kinds of technology. So we focus on, I think recycling is important for certain, and that's why I highlighted, okay, we have to divide the waste. We are just not to consider strategic raw materials as a group. We have to consider the specific strategic raw materials or a group of strategic raw materials, and then we are able also to say, okay, we have substitution, we have replacement opportunities for this, but not for these other raw materials. And then we have to implement our capacity of import, for example, for third countries, for those strategic raw materials, or to create new technology and then to substitute and to create substitution and replacement materials. Thank you.
Thank you. I think there was one more question, and I think, then we should slowly come to it.
All right, then I try to keep it brief. I have a mix of questions and small comments. Also, maybe I'm then a bit embarrassed because I don't know so much about like banking and stuff to ask a very simple question, but I was just wondering how the digital euro, or is it logical, I don't know, could play a role in creating a financial union, because like, I mean, in digital sphere, that's what's named often, especially also being a global standard setter, like that capital flows are just hampered, and I don't know, can you redo the system with that somehow? And I know the problem is normally the taxes, but can you maybe harmonize it on this digital euro sphere to create new investment methods to foster innovation? I know that those are really, generic sentences I just said, but maybe in that direction, and you say no, that does not make sense at all, then I'm also fine with the answer. To Esther, I just want to say that it's a really cool perspective, looking at the nodes of the supply chain and like how to steer them, and that just gave me a lot of thought that I will take home, but I don't have a fixed question there. And then kind of a comment and a question, but also maybe it's to all of you, but mostly I guess to Raffaele, because I was thinking, I mean, researching on the Brussels effect, the EU as a global standard center, and then generally, I mean, I guess it's now with the geoeconomic turn, the US is forcing others, China's forcing others, the EU is trying to not let it look like it, but it also goes in a way. And then before it was things are convincing or things are economically sound for other countries or companies to take over these standards, and now they're also really uneconomic aspects other countries follow, especially the US. And probably it's mostly about increasing the benefits for especially the smaller countries, maybe combine or make like raw material deals, like you get ours, we get yours, and also combine the channels. And regarding the channels of externalizing influence, also was regarding the Brussels effect, that the question would be and the easiest way to create a de facto and then maybe de jure Brussels effect, have product focused regulations. I was just wondering how many product focused regulations are, for example, in the Raw Materials Act. Is there, for example, explicit regulation on how to recycle products in the Raw Materials Act, and so to detract, because like this regulation, you could, like if companies have to create products that they have to be recyclable in this way, or raw materials have to be extractable, they would have to do it probably for the whole world, and maybe then you can also attach other normative things like values and all that sense. So this is more to Raffaele, but actually to anyone who likes to answer. Thank you very much.
Yes, thanks for your question. Maybe first as kind of a further explanation, because I didn't expect that everyone here has heard so much about the digital euro and its regulation. So the legal design of the digital euro, as it is proposed in the digital euro regulation, which is still negotiated at the time at the European Parliament, it provides that the digital euro has a very limited use. So it shall mainly function as an alternative to cash, and practically also to an alternative to other payment methods that are used in everyday transactions, like in the supermarket or online for buying stuff there for normal customers. So, for instance, there will be this holding limit that I addressed, and this will prevent that any end user can hold more than a certain amount of digital euro in his wallet. So this feature is supposed to protect financial stability. It is meant to prevent these effects, these displacement effects in the disintermediation of the financial system. So from a political or economic perspective, you might criticize this approach as too cautious or too conservative and not using the potential of digital money. But for that reasons, I think also those scenarios that you have addressed are not probable that they will be realized. But in legal scholarships, there are also there are some interesting contributions on this topic that also address the potential of digital central bank money from a legal critical point of view, like Katharina Pistor or Robert Hockett. They imagine a scenario, a future system of money that is more public and more democratical, and they see digital central bank money as a possible tool to implement such system. So that's, but this is more a theoretical debate that is not taking place in the political sphere so far. I mean, there are some contributions and some from I think the lefts in the European Parliament. They published a paper on a more public digital euro, but I think they won't be successful with this approach. And also from the right-wing parties, they from the other side raised concerns about too much state control, and they fear, or they express this fear, that the state can and the central bank could gain too much power by and I think the middle way that they now pursue, and in the majority in the US legislation, that is the approach to find a balanced solution, but a careful solution that is not triggering too much disruption in the system.
Regarding your question that you gave kind of to all three of us about whether the EU can remain a standard setter, at the end of the day, it is still down to economics. Yes, the EU has this sophisticated institutional structure, large consumer base, somewhat disparate but also deep capital markets, whether here in Germany and so forth. But at the end of the day, the economic case still has to be there. So, for example, recently China released its own supply chain a framework which basically stated to its companies that if you choose to abide by some of these supply chain instruments in corporate due diligence and so forth, it could potentially be in contravention of our own domestic law. So really showing that the choice lies with firms whether they want to continue to comply or they go elsewhere, which they can increasingly now do because, as you know, some of the key centers of economic commerce and development are not only solely in Europe but also increasingly in Southeast Asia and of course North America. So the case for Brussels to remain a key normative actor has to be coupled together with the economic case, ensuring that it continues to grow and develop, because that will be tied to the degree or willingness by which firms will continue to comply with these increasingly stringent standards. However, there is also recent jurisprudence in international economic law, that maybe these regional to regional trade arrangements could be an area by which you can balance these kind of standard setting norms of the EU with their own respective domestic interests. For example, the EU-Mercosur agreement is a perfect example of this, where they kind of balance the EU's own climate objectives and goals with the development orientation of the Mercosur states. So there is an emergent practice all around some of these core regional trade agreements that really show that there is a third way by which you can still balance norms, even though you may not necessarily be the core global standard setter. So definitely look into those. Yeah.
Thank you very much. Yes, I think that as Esther also said, the European Union is an important, very important regulator, but this must be also reinforced and supported by economic competitiveness. So that's why I think we insist on this concept of competitiveness, that maybe is also be a competitiveness obsession. So Paul Krugman in 1994 spoke about competitiveness obsession and anxiety, but above all obsession. I think that so we are as a regulator, we are able also to, we can say, to spread some technology, some requirements. If I refer to the eco-design of sustainable products regulation and a lot of requirements regarding refurbishment, reusability, repairability, and recover of of raw materials and in general of products. I think that it could also influence some technology also in third countries that maybe are supplier of raw materials. And I try to formulate it since and I think it's not like an idea that cannot be implemented, since, for example, in the field of hydrogen, we have now I refer to more to competition related issues, but in the field of hydrogen, we have some Commission's decision authorizing state aid for hydrogen plants settled in third countries, and the condition for the authorization, or one of the conditions for the authorization, is not only compatibility with the internal market, so Article 107, but it's also the fact that in that third country a supply chain, so a value chain for hydrogen is also established. So that this attempt to gain hydrogen for the European Union, so for the internal market from a third countries, but also have a beneficial aspects and beneficial effects also for that third country. I think there is also an attempt in the Critical Raw Materials Act, so there is the idea to implement it and then to create, to export, so to regulate, but also to create like a technical and regulatory framework also abroad, but at this standards of the state of art, some strategic partnerships with third countries, also small third countries, are not working that well as expected in the Critical Raw Materials Act. This is also one of the critics that are shortcomings that are addressed in the special report of the European Court of Auditors, since the European Court of Auditors highlights that the European Commission is not able to provide so the outcomes, the effects, so the results of these strategic partnerships nowadays, so which effects effectively these strategic partners are producing for the internal market and for the third country. So the focus is the third country. I think it's very important, and we cannot like forget it or just neglect it.
All right, thank you very much. I think for the sake of timing, it would be quite good to move the further discussion to lunch. So basically I would say we are done actually with this year's YELS conference. First of all, or before we all go to lunch, let me and also Robert say a few final remarks and words. First of all, obviously, thank you to everyone who participated, who spoke, and who engaged in discussions, and also obviously all the organizing stuff and who supported us. And so now our further program is basically that we'll go to the university cafeteria, which is like a 5-minute walk from here. Everyone is obviously invited to join us. Afterwards, we will do our city tour, which will start in front of our conference venue here at 2 p.m. In case you decide not to come to lunch, you can meet us here at around 2 p.m. And otherwise, you can just follow along. And then one more quick note, please collect all your name tags like in front of like the room because we need to give them back. I think that's it from my side.
All right, just a quick addition. For lunch, you need those 2 vouchers that you have in your map. We have enough vouchers for guests as well. So from my side, I've been awfully quiet yesterday and today. So thank you all for coming, thank you all for contributing, thank you for all the help, thank you for the comments and so on and so forth. But there's one more thing I want to put as a thought. This is a self-organized conference that started traveling Europe. Started out in Austria a couple of years ago and now travels the continent. And this conference only takes place if there is someone taking over the job. So if any of you may find that interesting to host a conference like this at your university or with some friends at a partner university, please feel free to decide to do that next year for the 10th edition. Just approach us for any comments, for any help, for any organizational stuff. We're happy to help out and give some insights. And we're looking forward for the 10th edition next year somewhere else. So thank you all for coming and enjoy lunch.